Welcome to Optimize 24, the thought leadership event by AspenTech. Now we have with us Dr. Paige Morse, who's a sustainability director at AspenTech. Paige, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for your insight. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. But before we visit the wider premise of sustainability, both in the broader context and for AspenTech, it'd be worth asking, what is AspenTech's sustainability framework like?
Yeah, so I think sustainability has become such an important topic. As we think deeper on it at AspenTech, we think a lot about how we engage, which also means the audiences that we work with. So, how we engage with our community is important. So memberships that we have with industry, how we engage with our customers and help them solve their problems. But one of the basic pieces I often use is this concept of handprint and footprint. And this is an issue that most companies have when they think about sustainability. So handprint for us is most important. And what that means literally is how we help our customers. And that's what Optimize is about. We're talking about how we can help them solve their big, challenging sustainability issues. And our software is fundamental to help with efficiency or designing new systems. But footprint's also important. And so that's kind of back to what are we as a company? What about our own emissions? What are we doing differently as a company? We have to look at that area as well. But as I say, Optimize is all about how the handprint story, how we help our customers. But footprint's becoming increasingly important, and we're focused in that space as well.
You've got a plethora of clients that you work with. It's a rapidly expanding business. So offer us some color on the types of industries that you're working with in terms of advising them on their sustainability platforms, their footprint, and of course their journey forward for the next 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, sure. So, AspenTech's history is energy and chemicals, right? We started 4 decades ago. It was Exxon and Dow saying, we've got big challenges, help us. And we've continued to grow from that base. So we're very deep in the energy and chemical space. But we've also added some new industries recently, particularly in utilities. And I think they're all critical industries right now as we go through the energy transition and we begin to look at climate concerns with our operations. So we offer a real expertise with that because we've got such depth with energy and chemicals, and that's a lot of the speakers here is speaking in that space. But we've also now got this whole utility side. And what is interesting, I think, this is the first time that we've pulled in our utilities customers to have the same meeting with our energy and chemicals and more typical process industries. And at this moment, we have a lot to learn from each other. There's just, some people use the term convergence, really is as we rethink energy, we actually have to consider it in all different aspects. So the more traditional crude supplies, we also have to think about mining now as batteries become more important and other critical minerals. Then we have the utility side, which we've thought about for electricity, but that's becoming a bigger piece of the overall energy story, and we need to work together. And then chemicals' fundamental role is they are a huge consumer of energy. And I think people don't think about that as much, but in most regions, chemicals is the largest energy consumer as an industry. And so they've had this great need to kind of resolve their own energy issues. And then one other piece that I have to raise that's important to chemicals too is a big part of their business is based on using the byproducts of crude oil to make chemicals. And that is a huge thing we have to rethink, because as we move away from crude oil as a raw material for our energy systems, what will the chemicals guys use? Because we still use stuff, right? We're still going to drive cars around. We're still going to manufacture a lot of things, but we've got to rethink our raw materials. So having everyone together as we work through all this, I think is really important because we can learn from each other. We can also kind of talk through problems together. And that's a really important, I think, role that we play in kind of facilitating these conversations.
That sets us up nicely for my next question. How are you co-innovating on the circular economy?
Yeah. In order to be efficient in the circular economy, you actually have to connect all the value chains. And that's what's really difficult, because typically companies operate in their specific environment. But if we now need to think about the waste they generate and how we can turn it back into feedstock, that means everybody in that area, every company that participates, every raw material handler needs to be talking. And so that is a big challenge in the circular economy. So we're helping customers make the connections because we are connected with a lot of those companies. But also, I have to tell you, a critical area where we've really been doing this is through our industry memberships. This has been an important thing. It was mentioned briefly earlier in today's discussion is we're members of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And this is a really important group, in my view, because what they're doing is they're connecting all the value chains that are involved in plastics to make sure that after the plastic is finished being used, it can get converted back into another new material. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Technically, we're involved in all of that, but it's also about the connections between those companies. And we are working with all of them to do that. And I do find that it's our engagement through these industry memberships that help us make those connections. And that's just the first example. We actually are part of another group called the Energy Transitions Commission, which again is rethinking all of this. But to go back to circular economy, the most common example these days is plastics for circularity. And of course, that's important. When we finish with the plastic, the waste gets collected and then it gets converted back to a new raw material to make more plastic or something else. And, the first developed processes were what's called mechanical recycling. Simply, you remelt it and you reuse it for something else. But these days, it's getting even more complex because we've got so many types of plastic that you need to do advanced recycling. And that's where our technology can really help. We're working with a lot of companies in multiple continents now who are using new technologies to take that plastic apart and use it to make feedstock from more plastic or other materials. And that's the whole idea of circular economy, is that you keep it in motion, you keep using that carbon. Plastics is the most common example, but there are so many others. The big new challenge I see coming technically is how do we use CO2 as a raw material? And it's not easy. I'm a chemist from the start, and so CO2 is what I call a happy molecule. It doesn't want to change to anything else. So in order to change it, you have to really work on that. Our technology is great for helping people do that. We heard earlier about some examples where people are taking CO2 and converting it to methanol, which is a really important starting material for the chemical industry. So here's an example of, maybe you've used petrochemicals before for methanol, but now we're going to use CO2, which unfortunately we have an abundance of. So we can use that as a new raw material. And I think that, to me, it's a good reflection of what the circular economy is about, is how do we keep this carbon in motion and keep using it multiple times and eliminate the waste, and then also make sure we don't use too much energy in all those processes. We're part of all those new research challenges these days.
See, it's an exciting time to be an engineer, to be a technologist in this sphere, but even the most pragmatic engineer or technologist would admit that you cannot separate yourself from the wider legislative or regulatory climate. Now, in the context of that, we've had some various global laws and supportive legislations come out. One of them is the Inflation Reduction Act. So
Yeah.
I would really love your comments on how do you see that unfolding? What have you noticed so far in the market? And do you generally think it's a force for good that'll create a more conducive investment climate?
Yeah, I think the Inflation Reduction Act has had such a huge impact here in the U.S. And to be clear, when it comes to policy activity, it's very region specific. So the U.S. needed to do something very specific to incent people in this area. And what that meant was providing some support to build new units and try new technologies. That was really important. And what we had to do here was quite different than other regions, primarily because the U.S. has been quite spoiled for a long time. Energy is cheap. And so therefore, what's the economic situation to make it justified to actually do the business? What was necessary was to get some federal support. And IRA has done that very effectively by encouraging carbon capture activity, hydrogen activity, and even now more and more for energy efficiency as well, which is also really critical. So I think it's been fundamental to jumpstart. And one thing that's been interesting to watch is now other regions are saying, IRA's beginning to draw investment from other regions. What are we going to do differently? Well, that's good competition in my view. If we can encourage people to invest more in all these new technologies, that's a good thing. It's going to be different in each place, though. Yes.
If I may request you to sort of elaborate on that, you mentioned that it's had a positive impact, that there is a bit of navel gazing going on in other parts of the world. Mm. You are a global operator. You're in 60 plus countries. So what are your market antennae telling you? What feedback are you picking up from other regions around the world saying, well, maybe we should attempt something similar?
Yeah, I think similar, yes. And it depends a lot. In fact, I've been having conversations here at Optimize exactly on this topic. You've got to think about what the regional stresses are. As I bring up, in North America, energy is cheap. And so how you put together the business case, it can be challenging. In Europe, they've got great technical capability, but energy has been a challenge for them. So they've got to think differently about encouraging investment and development. And you also have a very different public view that they need to be contributing more, which is the U.S. is coming along in that view in terms of consumers. But Europe is much more in favor of this kind of activity, and they're able to get it moving along. Asia has been another completely different challenge, of course, right? Because it's a very fast-moving, fast growth area. They're looking to really change lifestyles with a lot of their new development. The plus is they get to use the new and the latest technology, which has, I think, been very helpful in them moving quickly in terms of a lot of the development in Asia. And I realize I'm lumping it. Asia's got a little pockets of things too, but generally they're much more faster growing. So as I say, how you position things each is differently. Government incentives, I think, are critical in all of them, but they need to behave differently depending on the business environment. That's what we have found. So for example, I'll just give you an example. In Europe, they've got some restrictions and requirements that they need to do that requires tracking. We can help with that immensely because it means keeping track of when you've used a renewable raw material or whether or not you're able to integrate waste materials. You have to track that in Europe. They can use our technology to do that. Other regions aren't requiring that yet. In the U.S., instead, it's about rethinking your infrastructure and how you can build up a hydrogen hub, for example, and get a lot of participants. That's a different kind of need that we've got in the U.S. that the government is helping.
And you know, I've got to put you on the spot here as we reach the end of this conversation. You have a background in chemical engineering. You are now a technologist with AspenTech. Amalgamate the two worlds for us and spell out what kind of digital horizon are some of the chemical engineering firms, some of the chemical manufacturers, what are they looking at, and where do you sit in the bigger picture?
And all of that. Well, I think of technology as being the way that we're going to solve these really big problems. And so I think it's important that we integrate everything that we've learned and then look at the new requirements going forward and get creative. Put the right group of people in a room and let's think it all through and come up with new solutions, which I do feel is some of what we're doing here at Optimize right now as well, is coming up with new ideas together.
Paige, thank you so much for your time. It was very insightful.
Thank you.
Listening to you. That was Dr. Paige Morse, Sustainability Director at AspenTech.